Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's great to see y'all. We are low this morning, I know, on quite a few people, and we've got people coming in and going out. Hudson, one of our other members of the training team, will be here in about an hour, and we'll be jumping in and doing stuff. Debbie Foster is on her way in as well. She's been on the other side of the country until late last night, so she's probably a little figuring out what time it is exactly. And I know we're missing several people from our different congregations, and so we are going to record this again. And sometime this week, I will put the recording along with the slides together and send that out, so that everybody can have that and be able to share with those who are missing. I know one of our coaches, Anna, was supposed to be here today, and she has one that is sick, and so she's so sad because she wasn't able to be with us the first time too. And so hopefully our third gathering, she will be able to be with us. Well, welcome to Training 2. In this module, like where we're beginning right now and throughout today, if you'll go to slide 2, Christy, we are going to be doing this act part. We've done listen for the past few months. We're moving into act, and the final portion will be to share. So we're going to be spending time in act, learn by doing, using action learning to discover God's leading. And we're going to be talking through what does that actually mean and how do we do this together. I want to just kind of draw your attention to what that means. We're going to learn how to use action learning to discover God's leading, learn how to act your way into new thinking, and plan your action learning experiments. So last few months have been all about listening and hearing what is all around you. And coming up, we're going to be really focusing today on how you do experiments and what experiments might look like, and offering some opportunities to talk through those together. I invite you to look at your participant packet on page 3. And just a quick run through of our meeting today. In just a few moments, we're going to be doing our welcome and dwelling in scripture together. Following that, Anthony is going to be leading us through a time you are here, kind of centering ourselves on where we have been and then looking towards where we are going. The next step, action learning, experiments, and case study is Hudson? Yes. And then you're
yes.
Okay. So this is Hudson will be leading us through this, walking us through a case study where we'll actually be able to look at what another church did and immerse ourselves in their thinking, and hopefully help us to figure out how we as your church might work. And then following that, we're going to be doing action learning, experiment assignment options, and team planning time. This is when you're going to be able to choose your experiment, or at least one, and talk about how you might invite the congregation to come alongside you in this experimentation period. And then finally, we will have where have you seen God at work today? Any questions about our schedule for this morning? Well, this morning, we're going to root ourselves in the dwelling of the word. We're going to spend time again in Acts 16. And you will notice on page 4, it's got the reminder of what dwelling in the word is. Hopefully, y'all have been doing that together in your time when you have been meeting either alone or with your coach. You have spent time pondering these questions of what caught your attention, what question would you want to ask, and what are we hearing in this text? Where might the Spirit be nudging us? And just a reminder of what that process looks like. We will start with prayer, and I'll ask that God would speak to you. We'll read the text slowly, allow for some time of silence, read again, allow for silence, and then I'm going to instruct on how we're going to talk about it and how we're going to share what bubbled up and answer those questions. If you look in your packet on page 5, you have the scripture, And it is actually in a different translation. It's in the CEB translation, and we've been doing it in the NIV. I'm going to pass out a page that has both on them, and for the possibility that when we have two people read, maybe one will read in one version and someone will read in the other version. Do I have two people who would be willing to read this morning? Sonia, all right, great. Sonia will be our first reader. And do I have someone who would be the second reader? Fantastic. Thank you, Sonia. All right, well, let us pray before we go through the scripture. Loving and gracious God, we are so grateful for this day and for this time to come together. We lift up those who cannot be with us at this time. And we are excited about bringing them alongside in the future, sharing all that we learn in this place at this time. Lord, be with us now as we turn our minds and our hearts to your word. Speak to us yet again. Allow us to hear your living word. In your son's name we pray.
Acts 16, 6-15. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the regions of Phrygia and Galatia, because the Holy Spirit kept them from speaking the word in the province of Asia. When they approached the province of Mysia, they tried to enter the province of Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus wouldn't let them. Passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas instead. A vision of a man from Macedonia came to Paul during the night. He stood urging Paul, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Immediately after he saw the vision, we prepared to leave for the province of Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. We sailed from Troas straight for Samothrace and came to Neapolis the following day. From there, we went to Philippi, the city of Macedonia's first district and a Roman colony. We stayed in that city several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the riverbank, where we thought there might be a place for prayer. We sat down and began to talk with the women who had gathered. One of the women was Lydia, a Gentile God worshiper from the city of Thyatira, a dealer in purple cloth. As she listened, the Lord enabled her to embrace Paul's message. Once she and her household were baptized, she urged, "Now that you have decided that I am a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us.
Spend a few moments in silence. What caught your attention? What questions would you want to ask? What might God be saying to you and to us as we listen to this text today?
Paul and his companions traveled to the region of Judah and kept the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, he got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace. And the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony in the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went out the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us.
To spend a couple of minutes reflecting on those questions. What caught your attention? What questions would you want to ask? And what might God be saying to you and to us as we listen to this text today? What I would like for y'all to do now is to find a partner that you don't know or that's not from your congregation. To spend about 6 to 8 minutes talking about this passage, reflecting on those questions. You don't have to answer every question when you're together, but the main thing really is to share what would you like to share with someone else? What did you hear in this scripture today that you want to share with someone else? So I've got 9:24, and so we'll spend about 6 to 8 minutes getting partners. And so you'll find a partner. Spend some time with us to do it. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and call us back. I'm hearing lots of wonderful conversations. But just kind of calling you back to this space.
And so what I would love to hear now is for you to share and possibly share what you heard your partner say rather than saying what you said. What did y'all hear? What emerged from this text today?
Yeah, very good.
I'm still not fine.
The fact that people were listening, they were receptive because they were listening. It's interesting that we don't know who Paul's companions may have been, the pluralists there, but obviously they were agreeing with him in this process because there's no indication of their questioning. We're not jumping out to go immediately having the answers. We talked about, of course, that's what might God be saying to us today. I won't go with everything else we said, but what he might be saying to us today is to listen and to wait for him. Perhaps like they were convinced, sometimes we have to be aware of certain circumstances, but trusting in God, not worried about the details. They didn't know what was ahead of them, and so that's a good point.
Did Jim want that say that? Not to worry about the details. Did Jim say that?
Yeah.
If Jim says don't worry about it, don't worry about it. You're good.
And then Jim said, as far as the question, what kept you going?
Ah, that's a great question. This is a
Not knowing
great
what your
question.
reception is going to be.
Yeah.
And why did you go? Why did you go and what kept you?
Great question.
Great
I'm
question.
amazed how
Okay.
every time we do this, what kept you going and why did you go? Thank you. Amazing.
Cindy brought up about the Holy Spirit, how it kept them from preaching, get the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit's
She's
work.
actually one of the one.
Yeah.
She's like me, she's a one person.
Mhm. It's a great question. Why?
Pam mentioned a couple of points and related to the Spirit. In the first few sentences, it talks about the Holy Spirit, and then it changes to the Spirit of Jesus.
Mhm.
Was there a difference there between those two? On that.
It's an interesting note.
Why did the Holy Spirit keep them from speaking? But how? How were they kept from going into Nicaea? Why were there only women at the, we're both science backgrounds, so we were looking for the logistics.
And but we did say what's saying to us, we kind of went back to the listening and the paying attention. Because if the Holy Spirit is keeping, listen to that. Because in today's world, we just push through and do our thing, whatever we think is right. And yeah, the Holy Spirit's going to keep us from doing things, even that are good things like preaching, right? Yeah. So,
Susan brought up that, Paul was the only one who saw the vision. And so, his companions had to trust him. Had complete trust in him. We know Paul's background, so apparently they probably worked through that.
Allison, I noticed on these different translations is that in the NIV, it just says Lydia was a worshiper of God, but in the CEB, it mentions that she was a Gentile God worshiper.
Yeah. It's always interesting to look at two different translations and what speaks to you.
The one is that if you consider me a believer in the Lord. Now, and sad.
Very different.
Why are you doubting us?
Yeah.
Now that changed the tone for the if for me after reading the other translation. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very different meanings. Yeah, there's a swap.
Sonia brought up, what were they doing for their 3 days? So,
I know. I always wonder that too. What were they doing?
I talked about, Paul and his companions went to the rivers, watching the rivers, such as soothing place. Why did they go to the temple if they were going to pray?
That's where women were in. That's who you're talking. You didn't know it's who talk with men.
They're gonna have a scoop, right? Yeah.
It was interesting that said they expected to find a place of prayer, but didn't say they found a place of prayer.
I thought that, yeah.
But I honestly knew that when we were down there, it was a place of prayer and laundry.
Yeah.
So all that too, laundry.
Since it's a Roman colony, did they have to go outside?
Interesting.
Right, to the punch. Could have been dangerous.
Yeah.
Okay, we're very
Yeah.
inside.
Yeah. Great questions today.
So we were doing this with the pastors on the Zoom meeting, and one of them said, "Who is our Lydia?" Which I thought was an interesting question.
Yeah.
Who is Lydia? The Lydia's in our life.
What about that last question? I think some of you have kind of answered it, but what might God be saying to you and to us as we heard this text today?
At first, you have to listen. There's a difference between hearing. You're sitting there, and you might have the TV going on and hear it, but when you actually listen, you start to have some understanding. And then second was that God will enable you to hear what you need to hear. So there are times when something is spoken and God lets you know that is for you, because we hear things all throughout the day, but not everything is for us.
I see the kid. Don't let.
Do it now, when God says, yeah.
We got ready at once.
Immediately.
It's like, what did you think that?
I didn't get it.
That's right. There you go, they didn't have to test it, they said, this is what God's saying, we're good.
They didn't question
They
it.
didn't question.
One of my life lessons that I always respond to questions like this is you can't listen when you talk.
So true, so true.
It's like he's given us countless different examples where he's spoken. So not only be listening, like be expecting it, be ready, be waiting for it, so you can act on it.
What else?
One of the things that stood out to me was in the difference in the translations. The NIV, they were talking that it went where they expected to find a place of prayer. He says, where we thought there might be. And so that where we thought there might be, for me, there was some freedom and imagining and possibility. And so I did this next phase of there's some freedom to experiment. There's some freedom to imagine where you thought there might be. Yeah, so that I appreciated the different translations.
What might they have done if there wasn't one? Yeah, where would they?
The freedom for us to imagine.
Yeah.
Where we think there might be, you know, what might be.
What might be? Yeah. Thank you.
We have the advantage in that we've kind of been through the process, the training team. But one of the things about this innovative space we're in is that what we know is that by being in a different place, literally in a different location, and being outside your comfort zone, often is where the risky work of the Holy Spirit takes place. And so just looking ahead at the end of this text, I was reminded that this is an unexpected invitation to go to the Gentile worshipers' home. And so it probably caused Paul and his companions to go, not so sure about this. And what it takes for us to allow ourselves to be the one receiving somebody else's unexpected hospitality. I like to be in control, I don't know about y'all, but going into somebody else's space is not always the easiest thing for us to do, especially as we age. I'll claim that one.
Unexpected hospitality. Nice, thank you. What else? I always love this process because I think every single time we go through it, we hear something new. We hear a different question. We wonder together. And so continue to do that. We ask you to continue to do that individually and also as you continue together as groups to immerse yourself in this text and look at other translations as well. What might jump out if you read a different way? Thank you. I'm going to turn it over now to Anthony.
Hello. How's everyone? I'm reminded that because we all don't know each other, I brought some visual aids to help with this part of the presentation. I remember way back, to Six Flags. I grew up in Georgia. Six Flags, different places. You always had that sign that said, "You are here." You are here, and X always marked the spot. And the interesting thing about it, half the time, where here was, we weren't totally sure sometimes where here was. And you had to sort of figure out. In this part of the process, in this part of the training, what we're trying to do next is to sort of tell you where we are here. We also know how we got here from the dwelling in the Word. And then the next step is giving you an idea of what's next, and then reminding you what we just talked about. That's essentially what this next step is as far as the training. So, how do you teach people to try action learning? So, as I mentioned, review where you have been and where you are going. Share your listening work. Discern how to connect your listening work to your action learning experiment. One of the aims that we want to convey is how do you teach people to try action learning as a way of moving forward instead of meeting to death? I think someone mentioned that before. And one of the challenges when you have something new is to sort of see how you look at it. I'm not sure if any of y'all have seen this. This is sort of a puzzle. I thought I called it a puzzle. That you look at it. The goal of the puzzle is to move the ball between the cork and the wood stick that is inside the bottle. And as you move it around, again, it's a challenge of, well, exactly how do I do that? How do I make that work? Now, as we go through these slides, we keep passing that around. The goal is for you to begin to think, to imagine, how do you look at a new way of solving something when you're challenged with something maybe that you haven't seen before. Okay, next one. In your packets on page 6, which is the next page after going in, we'll cover this area and going back, showing that what we have been through before is showing how listening works in training 1, and sharing listening as we did through dwelling in the Word, and discerning how listening works with our actions on learning, and sort of how that fits with the next step of the process. So it's tracing God's movement, that's training 1, learning by doing, that's where we are today, and then sharing those stories and then intentionally reflecting on your actions, which when we get to that part, which is the second half of the page 6, if I can, it's 5 of those sections. I think it would be good if each person or different people would read those questions to make sure we're covering those questions when we get to that, part. Okay, next one. Sure. Okay, so on the questions, if I can have someone to volunteer to read these next questions.
Listen to others. What's one thing your guiding team learned from listening to people in your congregation?
Okay. Anyone else?
What's one thing your guiding team learned from having to do this assignment or empower other people to do it?
And then when you take time to reflect on the time you have spent dwelling in the Word and listening to the text and Acts together by going through the questions. And then these are some additional questions. Anyone else? I'm gonna go ahead.
What did your guiding team learn from listening to this text? How did you use the dwelling exercise in your congregation? What did your guiding team learn from doing this practice of listening to Acts 16 together and encouraging other people to do it?
Then finally, you would take some time to reflect on the listening work you did as you walked your neighborhood. What did you learn from paying attention to your neighborhood? Were you able to share pictures? Or if you remember sort of what is happening in your neighborhood? Just to share personally, for those of you who remember the story, so I'm with Mattoon, which is in the downtown area. And the downtown area is quickly changing a lot in Greenville. And so on May 19th, we have Unity Park that is opening up. And because of that, there's a lot of interest in a lot of things around Mattoon, which is, can't be more than 2 blocks from Unity Park, and a lot in the area. And so for us, as I mentioned the last time, we are currently predominantly African-American church, and all of our neighbors are all white. And before it used to be maybe split. And so for us, as far as listening, we're very interested in this next step in terms of action, in terms of some things we'll have to try. Some things we'll have to try.
I didn't even realize I got to
We want to say that.
Some things we'll have to try. And one of the things that we even mentioned as far as indwelling in the word is that they were ready and they immediately were prepared to move. And I wonder if that was for a period of time, not to take away from what's next. And maybe that's part of the action steps, that you commit to it being for a period of time, and therefore you're able to try. So for us at Mattoon, one of the action steps we have is that we will have, we have a space that allows for dogs to be in the yard. And that was fine, but now we're getting complaints from the neighbors closest to our property, to the church, saying that it's too much going on and perhaps it's time to intervene. So this is one neighbor out of 2 other neighbors who seem to be very happy about it. And so, but for us, it is a way to connect to the neighborhood. And for us, we are seeing quite a bit of activity in the neighborhood wanting to connect to us. That includes a celebration in October that's called
Porch Fest.
Porch Fest, thank you. Porch Fest, where the neighborhood comes together. There should be about 700 people there. And we certainly hope other Presbyterians will come out and join in that. And then now a new collaboration, Juneteenth, which will be on the 20th, where we expect for others to come in and celebrate Juneteenth in the neighborhood as well. And then shortly after that, sort of a precursor to the Porch Fest part, where we'll have a concert from one of the artists that will be in Porch Fest. So for us, a lot of connecting to the neighborhood and a lot of action steps and a lot of steps for us to take, and still a lot of listening. What next? What's there? What are we doing? So on this one, anybody figure out?
You take the cork out, right? Is
You
that
take-
how you start?
Exactly. It's certainly an example of how God sometimes just sort of turns things around for us. And that's how you do it.
There you go.
Spin the bottle.
Yeah, not quite spin that. But the point is that as you look at the action step, while it might be new, a new way of looking at it, it will challenge us in terms of trying to find a way that actually works, that actually unites us. One of the things I heard people say throughout, and I think it's one of the keys to the action step, is we. When you're dwelling in the word, we are looking at how God spoke to us. It might have been different parts, but we're very clear, we're very together on the discernment piece of it. And so as we get ready for the action step, can we still be together in that next step? Because that's the key. Okay, and the last piece, so as we move forward in this training, we look at how training 2 sort of fits the 3-part training process between listening, action, and then sharing. In the next part of the training, we'll learn what action experiments are, why they are helpful in this context.
So this is in some ways kind of making the shift from training one to training two. That's what we're doing here. So training one was really all about listening, and we've listened through the scripture. We've listened through neighborhood walks. We've talked about that. How we made these walks together. Listened through talking to folks in the community or your congregation about how they experience God. I'm working with Belton Prez, and we're still kind of in the midst of some of that process too. So these things that you started, they don't have to end. You can continue to walk the neighborhood if you haven't done that yet, or if you're still doing that individually and you have future plans. If you're still reaching out to people and listening to your congregation, those things don't have to stop. You can continue that. But what we're trying to do now, as Anthony has said, is kind of make that that next step forward in the training process and how we start to do put some action into our learning. So I want to start just with a little bit of a story about my seminary days. So while I was in seminary, I also was working on a master's of social work. One day a week, I would drive across New Jersey and go to a nursing facility there where I was working with a social worker in this continuum of care facility. My supervisor was a longtime social worker. Some of you have probably had this experience before where my supervisor taught me a lot. A lot of what he taught me was things not to do. Have you ever had that experience? Working with a boss or supervisor? But he gave me a lot of good tools as well. One of the things that I had to do as part of that program is verbatims. So after I met with a client, I would then have to race to a computer as quickly as I could to try to write out the conversation. So it could be a 30, even 45-minute meeting, and then you would race to try to remember, what did I say? What did he or she say? Have you all done that process before? It is a difficult one, I think, but a helpful one as well to really kind of examine a relationship or examine a conversation that you've had with someone. Did I actually say that?
Yeah.
Why did I say that? And then perhaps even more intimidating was sitting with my supervisor and him reading about the conversation that I just had on his behalf and the social work department's behalf. And one of the things that was kind of a key word through my social work studies and through this program was active listening, which is a term likely heard before, but he drove that point home. And that was definitely a tool that he gave me. So as he was reading through these verbatims, he would make marks along the way. I'm sure it was in red pen too, but he would make these marks. And one of the things that he kept coming back to was, look at this statement here. You didn't check that statement. Do you know what I mean by that? You didn't explore this. You moved on too quickly. And the point that he was, again, trying to drive home for me was, don't leave anything unexamined. Don't leave anything unchecked. What do you mean by that? Well, tell me what you're trying to say. Or I might try to summarize what I'm hearing, but is that right? Is that what you're trying to communicate? So those, I'll always remember in those verbatims, those check marks. So examine everything. Don't leave anything unchecked. What we're doing now as we move into that action learning phase of our training together is we're going back to the listening that we've done and we're checking it, right? And we're saying, what is that about? Or what's happening here? We're trying to uncover and explore what we've started to learn through our listening. That's what action learning is about. Let's go on to the next slide. So now that we've spent time kind of talking about the listening that we did in training one, we're going to move to these action learning experiments. We're going to try to talk a little bit about why this is an important next step. So let's go on to what is an experiment? Yeah, slide 29. An experiment in this process is a planned action learning experience that is designed to help us behave our way into new thinking. What does that mean? Behave our way into new thinking. How would you summarize that? Or how would you restate that? Behave our way into new thinking. To be flexible. Making a conscious effort, okay?
Changing some behaviors to move in that direction.
Okay. Okay. These experiments are also designed to create space for us to discover new ways to be the church in our context. I can't remember if we've talked about in this group before kind of the difference between adaptive change and technical change. Are you all familiar with that terminology? Adaptive change and technical change? Christy, I bet you do a lot of this in your coaching work. So can you give us just a brief description of technical change versus adaptive change?
Technical change is something that's pretty easy and obvious to change. And adaptive change is something that takes adaptation, that it's, look at it, it's got multiple factors and levels and often emotions and people and getting from one thing to the next. It's not easy, it's not fast, it takes a while, it takes experiments. And this is perfect. This is from Ron Hyman's work on adaptive leadership. And one of the things he talks about is running smart experiments. Yeah.
So here's a good example of technical change. When I started working at a church in Nashville, got to the church, and one of the things that they did with worship is they had acolytes. And the acolytes were 7 years old, 6, 7, 8 years old. And at that church, there was this giant communion table that was really tall. And then they put the communion table up on a step so it was even tall. And then they used candles that were this tall on top of the communion table. And every Sunday, the acolytes would come down and they couldn't reach the candles. They could never light the candles. They're jumping up. So every Sunday, somebody is walking down to help them reach the candles, right? And then at the end of the service, they couldn't reach up to put the candle out. So this was happening every Sunday. And finally, I went to the worship team and I said, we just need to make an easy change here. Either we need shorter candles or we need taller acolytes, right? That's the technical change, though. There's a pretty easy shift that you can make to make the acolyting part of the service work smoothly, right? We either need to make shorter candles, have shorter candles, so these acolytes are set up for success, or they need to be a little bit older so that they can reach the candles. And an adaptive change would be more on some bigger questions of what is it about our service that isn't connecting with people? Well, that's a much bigger question, which would require adaptive thinking, adaptive experimentation, and adaptive change. One of the things
Can
that
I add something there
Sure,
too?
yeah.
We always call it low hanging fruit. What can you go in and just do and see? But sometimes, for me, those technical shifts, that when you do those things that might be easy, it sends kind of an unspoken message that it's okay to experiment and to do the adaptive change. Because I bet when you got the shorter candles or the taller acolytes, it kind of opens, somebody said, the freedom to imagine. It's kind of opens your mind to thinking more about that adaptive change.
My experiments are nice, especially when we use it with our congregation in the store. We can say, we're going to try this experiment. So it's not a permanent thing, right? Like people get scared.
Right.
We're making this change that's a big adaptive change. Instead of saying, hey, we're going to try something.
So one point of clarification that I want to make, and this is my interpretation. So Presley, Debbie, please correct me if I'm reading this differently. But What the experiments that we're entering into now are not the adaptive change. You're not entering into an experiment where you're saying, we are now trying the adaptive change. This is kind of the half step before that, where you're saying, we're trying to learn where the adaptive change may be.
Yeah,
Is that fair?
I think it's very fair. And I would just say, as another way of being adaptive, is you need to give give yourself permission to not quite get this quite yet. Some of us have been doing this work for a decade and we're still trying to discern technical, adaptive, and let that go and just lean into the fun and the play of what it was like when you were in kindergarten and your teacher put 100 things on a table and you got to just do what you wanted. So yeah, don't get caught up in the label as much as the invitation.
So we're calling these action learning experiments, and I circled learning because I do think that's kind of the emphasis of what this is about. You know, we've been doing listening, so it would be easy, I think, for us to circle action. Or the word experiment is such a big, open-ended word, we might focus there, but I think the point of these is still learning. You're still in a learning process. Again, I come back to that example of being in social work school, and we're checking that listening that we've done and trying to uncover what else is there. So these action learning experiments are about learning. I think the next slide maybe speaks to that a little bit. So the success of an experiment is determined by how much we learn and are transformed by the experience, rather than by how much impact our actions may have on others. So this is, again, the success is defined by the learning, not necessarily by the product or the fruit or the result that's happening from this experiment. In just a second, we're going to talk through a case example of an action learning experience, and I think that's going to kind of illuminate some of what we're saying here. One of our members of our guiding team in our first meeting together offered a phrase which I've stolen and claimed as my own, and I've told her that I'm not crediting her. But I've used it with my congregation some too. But we're still talking about process, not product. Even with these action learning experiments, we're talking about process, not product. What we're trying to do is learn more about the listening that we've done.
Hudson, would it be fair to say that failure is a part of the learning?
Yes, and we're gonna talk more about that as we go through and as you see kind of this example experiment. That failure is a part of it. And in a recent coaching call with someone from Faithful Innovations, one of the things that she offered that I thought was a great statement is, as long as you're learning something, it's not a failure. So that's kind of a redefinition of success or failure. As long as you have a takeaway of learning, then you've succeeded in the experiment. That's a little bit of a red, isn't it? Going into it.
Yeah, like failure is,
Okay.
yeah.
It's like Babe Ruth.
Yeah, exactly.
You run
So
5
many.
and we're striking.
Yeah, but we don't talk about the strikeouts. It's like failure is the fertilizer to success.
Yeah,
We're
and-
trying to learn the process more than develop a solution. We're trying to learn a process that will lead to a solution that's accepted by most of the people or respect most of the wants. I think what I'm getting hung up on here is all we're trying to do is learn an abstract thinking process that results in what we need. Now this, and speaking as a Presbyterian, I think this is sort of going against the concept. So, how do you make this square peg fit the round hole?
Yeah, and it goes a little bit against a decent and an order and get things done that Presbyterians are so good about as well, where we're trying to offer ourselves a little more freedom and flexibility here, and some of you have even kind of used those words already to say these are points of action, but you're going to see as we go through, I'm going to define kind of a couple different ways that we can go about these, that they are their action, but when you come to this example, this case example, you may think, well, where was the action in that experiment? Because there's just so much listening that's happening in these two, listening and learning.
So if you really want to get your church's attention, and talking about failing forward and experiments, you can say, we're going to focus on a 4-letter F word. You're around. They won't forget that.
It sort of leads to the question that the concept of a session may have worked well 400 or 500 years ago. Is it still working today? Or does it need to be modified? I just,
It's a good adaptive.
I'll let it get thrown out here.
I'm going to turn that one over to the presbytery. No. So, but one of the things that, I'll give you an example, and we'll move on to the experiments in a second. You watch my time. I have a lot of still Baptist minister and watch that timing as much as I should. One of the things that we've done on our session and in our committee teams and our ministry teams as well is we talked about Joan Gray's metaphor of the sailboat church in here before.
Not
Are y'all
here.
familiar with that?
Not in here.
Do I have time, 3 minutes to try to?
Sure.
Okay. So Joan Gray, Presbyterian author, pastor, one of the fantastic metaphors that she has offered the church is the idea of a rowboat church versus a sailboat church. And I think this is very related to the work that we do
It
in
is.
faith organizations as well.
Yeah, Limestone's doing the Legacy Partnership Project, and they're part of that's reading this book.
My session is reading the book.
Yeah, so it's
So-
very visible.
So what happens in a rowboat? How does a rowboat work?
It's a lot of effort.
It's effort. Who makes the rowboat move?
Humans.
Yes, people in the rowboat make the rowboat.
Equal effort, otherwise it goes to.
So in a rowboat, you're providing power. The people who are in the rowboat are providing. Joan Gray says that that's the way churches have tried to operate, and it's easy to fall into that model of we're going to get it done, and we're going to be good Presbyterians and do the work and do committees, and we're going to make it happen. One kind of shift in thinking that she offers to the rowboat model is a sailboat church. How does a sailboat work? The wind, right? The wind provides the power. Now, that works nicely with Christian language and theology, because in Christian
Depending
thought,
on how you attack the wheel, the boat will go regardless of the direction of the wind. That's the direction. Yes.
well, and in Christian language, pneuma or wind or breath or spirit. So the spirit is the one that provides the force, the momentum for the sailboat church. So one of the things that we do on our session, Jim, and in our committee teams is after setting it up with six weeks of a sailboat church sermon series, one of the things that we've done as part of our committee meetings and session meetings is to start our agenda with sailboat time or sailing time. So we start by just asking the question, before we get into the technical boom agenda, here we go, we got to make these boats and do these things. We try to start with some of the adaptive. Where is the Spirit moving us? Where is the Spirit taking us? So starting those conversations, even on something as technical as a session, to allow that time for exploration of where the Spirit may be taking us. And what we're doing now, this experimentation, is definitely sailing time. This is sailboat church time. Okay, let's move into talking about how we design an experiment. So we have some science people in the room. So can you think back to grade school and what are the parts of an experiment?
Hypothesis.
Yes. And even before that is the observation.
Ask
You-
a question.
you make you make an observation, then you ask a question of the observation, and then you move to the hypothesis of what you think might happen. But it starts with that learning. It starts with the observation. So if you go to the parts of the experiment for what we're doing, the action learning experiment, it starts with those observations that your guiding team has made. Name what you want to learn. So you're talking about what are the things that we listen to and what do we want to learn more about? So in your neighborhood walk, in your conversations with church members, you're in the interviews that you've done or are going to do. In your dwelling on the word, what are the things that you want to learn? So you start with something that you want to learn. And then what you want to do is, and we're going to go through all of these, you describe the steps that you will take in the experiment. Just like from grade school, you're going to name the parts of your experiment. What are the steps of the experiment? And then create a feedback loop, which is just a fancy way, I think, of saying, like, I'll make sure that you have time to talk about what you're learning, right? Make sure that you have built that into your experiment, is that you're not just doing this and then there's no chance to breathe. I think one of the things that churches are notorious for is church surveys that then are never followed up, right? Like, we ask all of these things of the church member, here's a survey, and then it just like evaporates. Like, well, whatever happened to that church survey? Or we had all these whiteboard sessions, and whatever happened with that information? So in the experiment itself, this is not a part that I want you to skip over. You want to build in that time where you're talking about the experiment, where you're talking about what you're learning, all right? You don't want to waste that opportunity. So these are kind of the three major steps. As we go through here, I want to highlight one thing. We're using steps twice, and that threw me off as I was kind of going back through training too. So these are the steps of the experiment. Within the experiment itself, there's also the steps that you as a guiding team are creating. So I just want to kind of clarify that. All right. We'll pause here just for a second to see if there's any questions, because what we're going to move to next, especially if we go to the next slide, is an example experiment, which I think can kind of highlight where we're going. So, any questions? Anything? Points of clarification? I'll leave that up to the timekeeper.
It's about time.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is. Yeah.
Let's do that. All right.
Before we talk
So.
about Mystic Lake.
So 15 minutes, it's 10:20, so 15 minutes, there's lots of going through. So please.
All right, everyone, y'all ready to get started? One point that Presley made that I think is, this will not be the last time you hear us say this. But so what is today? Today is the 7th. 6th? 7th, okay. So today's the 7th of May. We don't have training free until October, correct? And we're going to talk about when that will be. Don't ask me that question. That's a press question later. But in October, we'll have training free. So when we start talking about experiments, you may not be doing just one experiment as a guidance team. You may start one experiment and it may just not work, but you learn, hopefully you learn something about why it didn't work or why you want to try something else, and you may get into another experiment. And along the way, these experiments, again, they're teaching you. You're learning from them, even if nothing specific is produced. And I'm just gonna have to keep saying this because I feel like I'm preaching to myself when I say this. But you are not in these experiments creating your next great big program for your church. You're not creating your next big great ministry.
Preach it, Hudson.
Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, this is my interpretation. I find there's a lot of relief and freedom in that, and I hope that you feel that too. So
What if we want it to be the next big thing?
What's that?
What if we want it to be?
It might be.
God,
It might
God,
turn
what
out.
if-
The Holy Spirit's already
working, doing that.
That could
Could
turn
be.
out to be.
I mean, you know, yeah, you have a situation.
But yes, but what, and I think what your coach would probably say, or what I would say from a coaching perspective is, but what you don't want to do is skip the learning phase.
Yeah.
Right? So don't jump into that ministry or program without first doing the learning.
Yeah.
If you have an idea, this is more of a coaching conversation, but if you have an idea of where that might be, take a half step back and say, what do we need to learn first? Right? And so that's what these experiments are about. Is about learning.
And I would also say small experiments first before tackling the big, exciting thing that you have. Because if you think too large, it might not work. So start small.
Yeah. So I think this example, I'm trying to think of if this where this church is.
Looks like the Scooby-Doo bus.
It does a little bit. It's the mystery reveal or whatever it is. I think this example that they provided as part of this training is extremely helpful. So let's walk through this together. This is an experiment that a church designed after going through the training too. They wanted to, one of the things that they noticed around their church is that there was this bus that people were taking to the local casino. And so their learning objective, remember that first step is what do we want to learn about? Their learning objective was, we want to learn what God is doing in the lives of the people who ride on the casino bus from our neighborhood. So this bus, they noticed this purple bus coming through their neighborhood, and they said, wonder what happens on this purple bus. And maybe we want to know, maybe we don't want to know, but they said, we want to know what God might be up to in the lives of the people who are riding this bus. So that was their learning objective. Why do we want to learn this? In our listening work, so the work that we did first through dwelling, and through neighborhood walks and pictures, and through talking to people, we noticed this free purple bus. They were picking people up from our neighborhood. And we felt led by God to focus on what was happening on those buses. So this is why they want to learn. So that's step one, is the learning objective. So again, if you go back, I wonder what page that is in here. 7. So go back on 7. Keep walking through this. This is at the bottom of 7. Name what you want to learn. Describe the steps you will take in the experiment. So first, name what you want to learn. We want to learn what's happening in the bus. So now the next part that they're doing as a guiding team is saying, what are the steps that we're going to take so that we can learn more? And those steps are there on page 8 of your packet. So Preston can go to the next slide. First, we're going to recruit 8 people. Then we're going to use the bus schedule to find a time we can all ride the bus, split up in pairs. Pray that God would open up conversations for us. Get on the bus and sit next to someone we don't know. Look for an opportunity to start a conversation. And then if anyone asks why you're on the bus, you tell them. So that was just their very practical steps of what they were going to do. So when they got on the bus, they wanted to sit next to someone they didn't know. That was kind of step 5. And you can see their little note, which was everyone. So this was kind of an easy thing to accomplish because these were new folks to know. Look for an opportunity to start a conversation and ask about the person's experience at the casino. With this note, they were especially wondering, was this their first time? Did they go regularly? Did they like it, don't like it? What was their favorite part going? If asked while they were on the bus, they decided to respond by saying they were interested in knowing more about who uses this bus service in this community and why. One of the things that I love about this example, this experiment example, is what is the ministry that has been done? Well, there's ministry of conversation. There's ministry of blessing someone with, a new connection, or so those are like basic level ministry products. But if you're looking at this, with eyes of a normal church program or ministry, you might be asking, well, what happened? Like, where was that actual action? So that's why the learning is so important to focus on here. It's an action learning experience. What are they learning through this experiment? And then we can go to the next slide. They made that important final step to say, what is our feedback loop? How are we going to talk about what we're learning? So they decided to eat at the casino buffet and discuss our experience of riding the bus and talking to people with a focus on the question, what do we think God is doing in the lives of the people who ride the casino bus? So this is just one example of how our congregation uses those 3 steps of what do we want to learn? What are the steps that we're going to take to learn what we hope to learn? And then the final step of creating that feedback loop. So these experiments help us to deepen our learning and understanding of God's presence and activity by helping us behave our way into new things. The behavior here is getting on the bus. So there is something it's a simple action, but in some ways it's a kind of intended thing. It works. I'm part of some back in the classroom setting a little bit. I'm doing some work at a seminary in Michigan. And the room, for whatever reason, even though there's a lot of pastors in there, the room is full of introverts, and we've all noticed this now too. We're all writers in some way, form, or fashion, and so we're just a bunch of introverts. I'm not a full extrovert, and I may be the most extroverted person there in the room. And so one of the things that we have to kind of force our way into is like conversation. So even as simple as getting on a bus and talking to someone sounds, those are still pretty big action steps, right? Especially if that's just completely unfamiliar to you. Bus is unfamiliar, people are unfamiliar, maybe casino is unfamiliar. So while there's a lot of learning, there may not be a lot that's, produced necessarily. There's still big experiments in that they're calling you into maybe uncomfortable situations, new situations.
Unexpected invitation.
Unexpected hospitality of listening to Lydia and going to her.
When I was finishing up my CPE residency, we went to Cherokee. And we went to Under These Hills then, and the drama. And then we went to the casino and ate at the buffet, which is phenomenal. And I was bargaining with my supervisor and said, how can I get out of writing my last 2 verbatims? He said, you go over there and talk to somebody and find out what drives them to be here. And you write it up. I said, I got this. Went over there and hung out, checked out who might be willing, eased up, and so it kind of reminded me of doing that. And it is interesting. That's an interesting concept, because we tend to label casino people as one of our very own in our church goes. The last church I was at, that's where they vacationed, but I don't know. That's an interesting concept to do that.
Well, and again, this church had in their listening process, they had just tried to pay attention to their neighborhood in new ways, which you all have done at least a little bit of that work by now. And suddenly, with these new eyes, with a fresh perspective, they see something that they haven't explored. So this is that exploration, that checking, right, of something that they've noticed. So you can even probably by now begin to think, oh, well, in our neighborhood walk, we came across this, or we noticed this. But what's really happening with that dynamic? What's happening in that set of restaurants or shops, or what's happening in that gathering of people in this place or that place? Let's explore that. Like how, and then the experiment is designed to give you a way to explore that. So
Hudson, can I add too? Because
Sure.
I was thinking when you were talking about sitting in your class, a recent situation that we had, and it's just amazing how God can really obviously use each other's gifts, but how we can work and pray to complement that. We have neighborhood meal ministry, and one of my gifts is, as you probably can tell, is I'm a talker. I love to talk. I love the stories. But Hudson and I were talking at break. I had a friend that was uncomfortable about she wouldn't have gotten on the bus, right? But we teamed up, and she had that mind to be able to go back and really listen and discern and say later, Susan, this is what I think was really being said here, you know, and I'm so appreciative of that. So I think sometimes in your experiments, how you complement people's gifts. And she said to me, she said, I would have never been in that position to walk up to somebody and strike up the conversation. And I said, well, I could never be that person to try to really discern what was really being shared. So it's just cool how in your groups you can do that.
I think that's neat because Pam, she grounds me. She says, well, let's, you know, I'm way up there, and she's reminded me in kind, gentle ways to pull back. And I think that you're right.
What's being said.
It's always something to learn.
So one of the things that the Faithful Innovation Training has built into this time together, which I think is really such a good move, is what we're going to have you do now is you all become the coach for a pretend guiding team. So I'm going to give you just a case study basically of this pretend guiding team, and we're going to ask you to be the coach for that guiding team. And I think when you step into the coach role, what that's going to do for you is that's going to help you kind of consider this task that's before you in a little bit of a different way. Have any of you had that experience of like coaching a little league or coaching a rec league for children? I played basketball my whole life. Played basketball my whole life, and you know, when I get on my basketball court, I, for the most part, know how to do it. Know how to play basketball. No, not to say that I play basketball well. That's not true. But I know what I'm supposed to do, right? But when you're coaching, I recently coached third and fourth grade team. When you're coaching third and fourth grade boys and trying to get them to actually like stand and listen to you and to give them information so that they can learn what a pick and roll is or how to box out, it forces you to think about those exercises or those pieces of basketball in a completely different way, because you're trying to find a way of how are you going to understand this, or how are you going to even listen to me? So being in that coaching role, I think, does help them to deepen your understanding of basketball or soccer or baseball or action learning experiments too. So we're going to force you into the coaching role, and I think that it will deepen your understanding of what we're trying to do here. So for our case study, we're going to use, I'm going to call it Pretend Presbyterian Church, not Pretend Lutheran Church, just because I don't want you going out saying we talked about the Pretend Lutheran Church. This, as you know, the Faithful Innovation comes
That's a
out
fun experiment, though.
Luther
Yeah.
Seminary. We're going to restate that as Pretend Presbyterian Church. So let's talk about Pretend Presbyterian Church. You can go to page 9 of your participant guide. What I would like to do is start with Pam over here. Do I have your name right? Pam, what I'd like to do is we're going to just read through, let's see, how many pages is this? We're reading through the end of page 10. That's right, isn't it? We're going to read from 9 all the way through 10. What I'd like you to do is just read a paragraph and then go to the next person. If for some reason you don't want to read, just say pass, and we'll just keep going around. But we're going to use this opportunity to hear different voices and different inflections, so you're not just hearing our voices today. So let's do that, Pam. If you'll start us off with Pretend Presbyterian Church.
I changed it up there.
Oh, look at you.
Yay.
Start listening to
Yeah, so I'll do that first part, and then let me read that just so everybody follows along, and then you can pick up with listening to others. So Pretend Presbyterian Church, Pretend has a guiding team of 3 people who did some of the listening work assigned in the last training. And here's some of what they've learned.
Listening to others. Team originally felt overwhelmed by the prospect of interviewing 18 people with questions about when people felt unspiritually alive. They weren't sure how they would ask people these questions because they seemed quite personal. They also weren't sure when they would ask people to have these conversations because it seemed like trying to do it on Sunday might be too much. However, the team learned a couple of things as they tried to figure out how to do this assignment.
First, they learned that other people were willing to be listeners along with them, and they didn't have to do all the interviews themselves. 2 people in the congregation were willing to help do the interviews, and that helped lighten the load of the work. These people felt honored to be invited to listen to others. It was a way they had never been asked to serve in the congregation before.
Second, they learned that people responded very well to being personally invited to share their stories. Once people understood the point of the listening interviews, they were willing to share their stories. Several of the interviews really produced meaningful conversations that were deeper than people were used to experiencing. Content of the listening sessions also produced some interesting insight. The interviews revealed that not many people had the space to talk about this part of their life. But people have had very significant experiences in their relationship with God that have greatly shaped their life. Those experiences came through a variety of life circumstances, both periods of suffering and struggle, as well as periods of personal discovery and success. Many people had never been invited to name these kinds of experiences as something God was doing, but when they thought back on it, they can clearly see God leading and shaping their life during these times. The guiding team listened together to this text in Acts 16 each time they got together. The team reflected on the flexibility it took the biblical characters in this passage to keep changing directions and plans as God led the group in different ways. They talked a lot about how the group would have known that the Spirit of Jesus prevented them from doing ministry. What did that look like? How did they know it was God stopping them and not something else? What were their discussions like about these decisions?
Challenges the congregation had faced recently were helped by God to redirect their energy in a different direction. One clear takeaway from dwelling on the content of this text was the need to be adaptable and to God's leading when trying to do ministry in new places and in new places.
The guiding team also invited the council to engage in dwelling in the Word at their meetings over these months. The council found this practice energizing. There were very good discussions about both the meaning of the text and the practice of dwelling itself. One member of the council thought that dwelling in the Word at the beginning of their meetings changed the way they engaged the other items on the agenda.
Through this practice of dwelling in the Word, the guiding team began to recognize how they are used to a clergy person explaining the text to them rather than interpreting it themselves. This was a bit scary at times for them. They wondered about whether or not they were reading something into the text that wasn't there. They wondered about how they could honor all the different perspectives people brought to the reading. But in general, they appreciated the chance to hear everyone's voice when thinking about this passage.
Listening to the neighborhood. The idea of taking pictures of ways people saw God at work in their neighborhood was challenging. The team wanted to be sure they respected the privacy of others. On top of that, it was hard to know what should count as something that showed God's presence and what shouldn't. The team ended up taking a few pictures of places and people in the neighborhood around their church building that they hadn't paid much attention to before.
The exercise caused them to walk into a few businesses near the church they hadn't engaged in before. They met the owners of a corner store and learned a bit about their background. They took a picture of the farmer's market as an example of God's provisions in their neighborhood. Even though the team felt like they already knew their neighborhood pretty well, they realized there were some things they hadn't been aware of. There were some new people in the area that they hadn't interacted with.
Overall, they realized that by paying attention differently to their surroundings, they noticed quite a few examples of people and places where God was clearly present that they wouldn't have otherwise noticed.
All right, so you all are about to become the coaches for PPC. I just had to get the acronym in there because that's what we do. So what I want you to do is possibly see if this sounds what we had discussed. It's going to take 15 minutes as guiding teams. Some of those teams would like for you to kind of come together because you don't have your full team, and that's fine. So we're going to kind of combine you into your guiding teams. I'm going to have you, and I'll discuss this in just a minute, but talk through 2 sets of questions for Virginia Presbyterian Church. And you'll spend that 15 minutes. And then I think what we should do is, if we have time, maybe spend 5 minutes as a whole group kind of debriefing together. I think that'll be kind of the simplest way of being able to, even in this moment, create a little bit of a feedback loop where we can share some of what we've come up with and some of what we've learned from this exercise. So here are the questions that you want to kind of take to this pretend church.
They're on page 11.
Okay, so this is on 11 of your participant guide. So basically what you've done, and the case study has broken it down for you. There are 3 sections, just like there have been 3 sections of training 1 for us as guidance. Those 3 sections are listening to others, so interviews with people, talking to folks in their congregation. So listening to others, dwelling on the word, specifically Acts 16, which we've been doing together. And then the 3rd section are the neighborhood walks. For each of those sections, when you come together in just a minute, you're going to ask this question of each one. What is something the team learned or noticed that they might want to spend more time learning about over the next few months? So in the listening to others section, what is something that the team learned or noticed that they might want to check, explore, spend more time learning about over the next few months? So you're going to do that. That's where you start for each of those 3 sections. What might they want to learn more about? Think about, again, that social worker's red pen. What needs to be checked? Where is there more to explore? What is there more to unbox? What is a loaded statement? What is something that we need to uncover more of what's happening here? So that's the first thing that you're going to do. So you're going to spend, you get 15 minutes to do this. You're going to spend about half of your time kind of doing that. So 7 minutes or so. You're going to spend the second half of your time actually beginning to brainstorm for each of those 3 sections. What might an action learning experiment look like? So the way that that's stated in your participant guide is, what is something the team could do and invite the congregation to do with them that would deepen their learning about something they noticed through the interviews they did? Okay, so here's the process of the way this is working. You're basically creating at least 3 things, 1 for each of those sections, of what they might want to learn more about. And then for each of those 3 things that they might want to learn more about, then you're coming up with what an action experiment might look like. Okay? You could come up with more, but you're coming up with at least 1 action learning experiment for each of those parts. The listening to others, dwelling on the word, and the neighborhood, exploring the neighborhood. Okay, that's kind of like drinking from the fire hose, I know, but does that make sense? And we are available. We can kind of help describe that process. You have the questions there in front of you. you might find this to be difficult, especially because we're talking about a church you just learned about, in a pretend Presbyterian church, and a case study you're just learning about. But I think that this will give you a taste of what you'll be doing as guiding team as well. And so if you find yourself thinking, it's hard to know what good action learning spirit might be, that's okay. I think that's normal. That's to be expected. And likely you're going to find some of that within your own church that you know very well too. So all of that is part of the process of deepening our understanding of this process. Debbie, Preston, anything to add before we head in? So how should we split up, Presley?
I think maybe the two wants to join Limestone and then 2000 and I'll count them back there.
Call one of us over if you have questions about the way this is working. So you're going to want to refer to the case study itself on 9 and 10, and then you'll want to refer to the questions on page 11. All right, everyone. So we're going to spend 5 minutes. We're not going to spend a lot of time debriefing this, but I hope that it was a helpful exercise, because what's coming next is you talking about your own churches, no longer pretend churches, real churches, your church.
Roll up your sleeves.
Yeah, and thinking about where you're headed. So we can hear a little bit about what you came up with, but let's start first with just how was this process for you? How was the process of going through this? Tell me about that. Learning, okay. Let me check that statement. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, it made you really think, and then when we come up with ideas, you're learning. So, like the first one, the listening to others, we have Wednesday night suppers, and we took listening to one another's stories on page 7 of our first learning session, and we gave it to the members of the supper. And the first person that got up, we were astounded. We never thought he would get up because he keeps to himself. His wife, he's a lawyer, and his wife is at home with Alzheimer's. She's pretty bad. And he was actually asking for help. I mean, all of us were almost in tears when we got done. We were just shocked, and a lot of people shared.
Yeah.
Who we didn't think would.
And that sounds very similar to how this case study is written. This case study is written, although it's a pretend Presbyterian church, it's written from real examples, and it's written from faithful innovations work. And that surprise of, will people want to share? Will it be too intimate or too personal? But giving the opportunity, being blessed and surprised by those who are looking for a way to share their story. What about anyone else? This process of entering into the coaching role, how was that for you?
It's hard for me because apparently I'm task oriented. So then I want to get right down to find the answer instead of leaving it up to learn. I'm working on it, Christine. I want to find the solution.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard to leave it to the learning process.
And finding the answer to what ministry is coming next, or what program is coming next, or how can we engage in our community. All of that is coming down the road, but you're going to be able to better answer those things if you take time to learn first, right? If you learn first, then you're going to have a better shot of coming up with, what is eventually that adaptive change that our church wants to make, or that missional engaging program that we want to implement into the life of our congregation. But if we can take a breath and hold off and do the learning first, we're going to come to a better place of understanding, what's coming down the road for us. So that's hard. It's that moment of saying, like, we've got we've got more to learn. We've got more to understand before we're jumping in. But that's great. Thank you for sharing that. Others, the process of coaching for Pretend Presbyterian Church. How was that for you?
It's good to have some guiding steps that do help you focus. It's like if you were in an English class and the teacher said, you can write about anything you want. Where does your brain go? I mean, they give you a little bit of focus, like, oh, write about one event that was really important in your life. Then your brain isn't going everywhere. You have a little bit of focus. It's still going crazy within that category, but guidance helps structure your learning a little bit, because without it, you're bouncing everywhere in the universe. And it's like giving the people the opportunity to share. When they share and they look for a deeper meaning, then they see that all these things that have happened in their life, they can make the connection back to, oh, this was the Word, the Holy Spirit, and all those things.
Yeah, I think also one of the things about, if you think back to the example of the bus and the steps that they wrote out, which those steps on that bus experiment were so very simple, but it also helped to set expectations a little bit. You know, like, we're walking on the bus, we're sitting next to someone we don't know. I mean, these are things that you don't even have to write out, but writing them out, it's like, oh, here are some things that we're doing, and as simple as they sound in a statement, they can be hard to do, but also it helps to kind of gauge the level of expectations that you have, which again is coming back. You've heard me say it ad nauseum, but just coming back to what are we going to learn together. Yeah. Others, the coaching process, maybe one more person and how that process was for you.
Vision. Just get ideas and we kind of start going like this. Maybe crispy over this.
What did she do that helped you open it back up?
She just started opening our minds and saying that you've got your options open. And just, you got to keep it.
We just wanted to, I was just encouraging them to be focusing on the learning and not jumping to the what and how and that. Like, and we're all so programmed this way. We're all so programmed. Oh, this is a great idea. Let's do it. I mean, they had it right. But instead of jumping straight to, all right, we're meeting twice a week on Wednesday nights. We're doing, whoa, hold on a second. Let's keep this as a learning experiment. Let's keep it as an experiment. And so maybe it is meeting twice a month on Wednesday night, but how when people show up, can you continue to focus on the learning piece of this and not jumping into what we think is the final answer, because you're going to learn along the way how to adapt that and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And you may have, to go back to your grade school knowledge of experimentation, you may have a hypothesis about where you're going to end up. But that the learning that you do through these experimentations may also show you that, that's not actually where God wants us to be. That's not actually what God wants us to do. So that's why you got to do the experimentation and the learning first. A good question to come back to as well, which was kind of the question for the folks on the bus, doing the bus experiment, is what is God doing in this? Fill in that blank however you need to fill in the blank. What is God doing here? And how can our experiment kind of uncover what God may be doing on the purple bus that comes into our neighborhood? What is God doing in the Mexican restaurant that just everybody goes to on whatever day? What is God doing, in that new park that's, a block from our church? By continuing to come back to that question, it leads you into the learning first, which is what this experimentation is about. Let's spend maybe just 2 more minutes and talk about what. So maybe I'll turn to this group in that first part. So the first part in Pretend Presbyterian Church was what was it? It was listening to others. So in the listening to others part, name me one thing that you felt like they needed to do more learning about, and what action, what experiment you came up with as a possible avenue for them learning more about that. Everybody pointing to the other person.
I think probably we realized, or they realized, that people were willing to share and maybe needed to share, wanted to share, whatever. So just basically, we were saying to them to think about the opportunities that they could give members to actually engage and share their experience. And
Yeah.
not depend on the individual church, of course.
Yeah. It could, yeah, something as simple as we're going to create the space for the sharing. Let's see what happens.
Or maybe sometimes even small groups. Sometimes people really speaking that could be in the home environment.
Yep. And then what you would do then is think through the actual steps of how you create that environment. It's not just, we'll have a Wednesday meal, but what can you do within that experiment to set up the steps for that actually happening and being possible? Maybe there's something that needs to happen with the room itself. Maybe there's something that needs to happen with the invitation as people are coming in. All of those things are things you can think about with the steps of the process. What about this group in the back? So thinking through the dwelling on the word portion of Pretend Presbyterian Church's summary. What was something that they needed to learn more about, and what was a potential experiment to do that?
We thought that continuing to learn about flexibility and adaptability in ministry was something they wanted to learn more about. And the thing that we felt like they could do would be to, for the guiding team to interview 2 people each, one-on-one, anonymously, with names to learn what something new they would like to see happening in the congregation, in the church, not necessarily a change, but just to kind of experiment.
Yeah. Did you? So I felt my heart rate like rise with that one. I think it's that the idea of flexibility is like, oh man, it's
I
so
was thinking
hard.
the same thing over
Like
here.
my blood pressure was going up as a pastor in a church setting. I'm like, oh, trying to help people be flexible. So I think that's a great thing to point out. And the one thing that I would encourage you, we said this before, is when you start thinking about that action learning or when you think about the action learning experiment, is also remembering to phrase it with God questions, phrase it with what is something that you think God might be leading us to, a new thing that God might be sending us to.
But you've got to ask. You can't hear the young, look to the young people, think what can we do? Or you can't say, oh, what could happen? What about the elderly people? You don't have to pray for people. You got this group of people, you got this group of people, I mean, you got this group of people. They're so set in their ways. They don't want change. So you've got to do it gradually.
How many of you thought about marketing?
That means. That means.
We all agree. We did talk about targeting the people on young people in the interviews. The ones that
Seriously.
so they can get buy-in.
Because if they feel included into it, then they feel they have a say.
Yeah. And this is, again, why the God question framing is so important, because then when they ask the question, it's not, what is your preference for what you would like to see? What is your opinion for what? It is inviting them into a higher level exploration of what might God be leading us into. So that reframing also is that push towards flexibility, because it's not like, oh, well, I want
What
this.
do you think?
Yep,
Why
right.
do you think God?
So the question itself would be very important in that exercise, because the question has to include the flexibility, I think, as well.
And that question makes them by default listen for God's voice.
Right.
It almost, when I heard you all talking, we are, and I'm not saying that programs are not important, because they are, but it's almost like we're so conditioned to have a program for this age group and a program for that age group. And where does the Spirit move to shift us into getting out of that, or use a different language besides programming, with the shift of our thinking? I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud.
Well, and I mean, it just sounds so consistent with the dwelling in the Word in Acts 16 of like, where is God taking us? Even the Apostle Paul did not know, right? And the flexibility that Paul and Silas, they're traveling together at this point, the flexibility that they have to maintain in where God might be taking them. Yeah. Great.
And I think just as an observer, that you have what if I were in your shoes, I would have predictable outcomes, the things I thought we're going to hear. Just asking the question is going to start transformation, because that's not a question we typically run around asking. You would think we would.
You think I'm looking at
You're throwing a boulder in the system just by asking a question.
So the third section was the neighborhood section. So we've Pretend Presbyterian Church. I think they took some pictures. You and your own guiding teams have walked. Probably by this point, you may have taken some pictures. You may not have. That doesn't really matter. The point is kind of opening your eyes to what's happening in the neighborhood. So looking at this table here and thinking through the Pretend Presbyterian Church's experience of walking in their neighborhood, what was one thing that they discovered that they probably need to learn more about and an action experiment for that thing?
We were talking about our own church. We sort of have a project in the very beginnings here that fits very well with what we're talking about here. So I think we immediately caught on to putting our situation into that situation.
And that's
a set of questions.
And Susan is heading us there next. So that's what we're on next. Well, so let me turn to did y'all talk about the Presbyterian Church?
Yes, it is. Neighborhood around their church, and what it shows is that it's pretty excellent food. That's what we do.
So y'all are, some of what you've done in that time, you're going to pick right up on in our next section together too. And Susan's going to lead us through that. Any other comments or questions about this exercise of stepping into the role of coach for PPC? Did you find it helpful? Yeah, it's not a bad thing to take with you to other places and other things that you do in the church setting or other. Imagine yourself having to coach your committee or to coach your church through a certain thing. By switching your perspective of where you stand in the narrative, in your own story, by shifting your perspective, you can begin to think of, it's like coaching third and fourth graders. I've got to think of a new way of saying how you box someone out, because that doesn't mean anything. So shift your perspective a little bit to think about, here's another way of kind of restating that or describing that could be.
And my head went straight, true confessions, to my family system too.
Yeah.
And when you were talking earlier, I thought, I need to be experimenting with this way of living and adapting even within my own family system, because I'm a fixer. So when issues and problems come up, I got to figure out a way to solve it. But if I'm asking, what is God saying, not what is Debbie saying, it's a really a big shift. So I'm going to press myself to take it to the family.
When we lived in Nashville, my wife worked at a middle school, and they asked me to be the cross-country coach. I've been running for a long time, many years, but I had never coached cross-country running before. They asked me to be a cross-country coach, and someone said, well, how do you coach running? I tell them to run faster. Yes, I don't know. Like, when I started into the process, it was like, how do you coach someone when you're running? Because when you run, you're just running and you're trying to go. So it was, it gave me kind of a new appreciation for the sport of running by stepping into the coaching role and thinking, oh, we're thinking about strides. We're thinking about what we run on what day. We're thinking about how you breathe, how you hold your hands, how your fingers go. All of these things that I kind of just did without thinking about. Now, by taking that new perspective, I have a fuller and I think better appreciation and joy and understanding of running by just shifting that perspective a little bit. So I think throughout this faithful innovations process, it might be something where you want to do that. Even as a guiding team, you want to think, how would we coach ourselves? And by changing that perspective, it may give you some new learning.
Every time you keep talking about that, I keep thinking of when you're preaching and the children's sermon.
Yeah.
I often find the children's sermon hard to prepare than
Yeah.
the sermon, because you've got to get it to a level that 4-year-olds will understand, right? But what I've found is every time you can do that, it's difficult. The adults pay attention and they get more out of the sermon, and once they've seen the children's sermon, it relates to it. So it's this process that just feeds the sermon itself, but it's challenging.
Right. I have a colleague that spent some time with last week, and he, like me, has a house full of children. So on Sunday mornings, he would leave his house in order to kind of get his mind and spirit right. And he talked about how he would go very early to a restaurant and just eat breakfast. And the same person would come in. So this was Sunday morning. That person was coming in from a late Saturday night into breakfast, whereas he was going preparing for church. And the person is an atheist, says that he is an atheist. But they got to know each other, and they would start eating Sunday morning breakfast together. And he would come over to my friend and say, what are we preaching about today? And so as he's wrapping up his sermon, he's now trying to describe what he's preaching about to someone who has no biblical literacy, who has not been in a church setting. And that new perspective, kind of like you're describing, Christy, paid, I think, a lot of dividends for his preaching, because I've got to be able to describe this to him. And that's going to be able to help me in going to a sermon and to my congregation. So I think you might want to take this little exercise of becoming a coach as we go through the faithful innovations process. If you find yourself in a stalemate and you need a new perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a great segue. We were talking at break about, as Christy was saying, the challenge of communicating with children. But I think there's also a challenge for us to go back and try to remember what it feels like to be a child. So go there with me for just a bit. I'm old. I remember playing spin the bottle.
What's that?
Tell us about that.
George Hamilton Davis III. I wrote his name all over my books and my notes because this was my first crush. We were in spin the bottle session. Raise your hand if you know what spin the bottle is.
Do we have to admit it?
This is what's wrong with our culture is the kids don't play spin the bottle. And we spin the bottle and everybody, the bottle landed on me. I think I sort of did this. And George Hamilton Davis sitting right beside me and leaned over and gave me the biggest kiss on the cheek. But it just made my day. He spun it up the bottom. But think back even younger than that. And some of you might have grandchildren. What do you see when you throw a bunch of art supplies or you bring in a refrigerator box or you put blocks up on the table? What do you observe? How do you see children play? Do they pick out who's going to be the manager, supervisor, pastor? No, what do they do? Cindy, share a little bit.
They just dive in. I mean, I do, just that it starts working.
Right.
Patty Carolyn's always gonna be one who wants up the leader, but they have a process to get there.
And then what happens when the blocks fall? It builds back up, right?
They might
Yeah, walk out
be tears,
there.
but
Might be a few tears. Right, they might fight a little bit over something, but in the process of play, we learn about a lot about ourselves, don't we? You know? And I think that, to me, we use the word when we first started going through these sessions. I remember Debbie saying, it was my first introduction to this work, it's life-giving. And I think that's the message. So much of what we do, it seems like, as we're adulting, right? We lose that life-giving opportunity. So I love the focus that we talked about this morning, that it gives us the freedom to imagine together, to partner with what God's doing, but to go back to that place of creativity. We're all creatures of creativity, right? It displays differently, but you go back to that place. A couple of things that tie into to the scripture that I want to share personally is this work, and I'm not on one of your guiding teams. Our church is signed up, and we're talking about how this will fit into some of the ministries of our church, but I'm not yet where y'all are. But I have found that this work has changed me. Raise your hand. Are you looking at not just your neighborhood, but your life a little differently? I am. I told Debbie I was really struggling with something personal this week, and I pulled out the Bible. And you know what I did? Is I pulled out this passage, and it spoke so clearly to me. So I think that's something that I think is an opportunity with this, is to remember that it's an opportunity for God to use that creative side of us, to go back to that place of play and have fun with it. Let it be life-giving. That's what's going to get people excited more than anything, I believe. One of the first things is you talk about your action learning experiments, and you can go to the next slide here, is there's really two different approaches. And this might be the easiest thing that you learned today. It was for me. I got this easy little nugget that I could talk to y'all about. And that is investing presence or investing relationship. And this to me triggered the whole ministry of presence that we know about. But just showing up, being present, investing in presence or investing in relationship. I looked up that word, invest. And reminds you of what you wear that's sleeveless, that's in there, root. Vest, right. And so the Latin for that is actually vestis. And it comes from having clothed or covered yourself with a garment. I thought about how many times in scripture do we read that in Colossians. Put on, clothe yourself in his righteousness. And so that whole word of investing in this work in terms of investing your presence. I think about clothing yourself, but clothing others as the body of Christ. Investing in relationships are the two pieces. The first one we're going to look at, this is on page 12 in your book. And we're talking about the places where in the work that you've had, in the conversation that you've had, what might just be bubbling up is an opportunity to spend more time in a space. For example, how many of you like QT? All right, I'm trying really hard to cut down on caffeine.
Look at
QT is the only place that I have found that has caffeine. It's Hudson's caffeine-free Diet Coke. So I go daily, and if you go after 3, the pastries are half price.
Can we add that to our bullet list?
If you go after 3, So you can get two pastries.
It's brought to you by
QT. No, I love QT. I do this thing. Who said they were task oriented? I do this thing. I have never spent more than 1 minute in QT. In line. And they just know, talk about quick, innovative. It's amazing. Man, glad to see you. We'll see you next time. It's like the Chick-fil-A. Pleasure to serve you. But I have found, I always went to QT. This has made me see QT differently. I've tried to seize that opportunity outside QT. Strike up conversations, to think about who it is, because it's really close to our church. It's really close to our church. So that's the spot that, selfishly, I was already spending some time on. But what places have you found in your work already together that you're saying maybe we could spend a little more time? There's a list here in your handbook, but what else what have you found this year?
A restaurant here. Several.
Some new restaurants?
An outdoor seating, outdoor park.
An outdoor park? Hazel, that's great. A brewery? Sure, yeah, casino. Big house, I was talking about earlier, experience. Anthony, you shared earlier this morning what's going on with the park there,
Oh, Unity Park?
Unity Park, outside. And boy, hasn't COVID taught us a lot about the beauty of being outside with worship. Other ideas? Okay, but there's a list here to kind of tickle you a little bit about what might be some places that you want to spend more time in a space, a place. And these are the questions that you might want to ask yourself. Next slide is, how would I describe the people here? I mean, who likes to spend time in an airport beside me? Who likes to people watch? And do you not make up a story about them in your head?
Who knows what they're making up about us?
Oh, no, I know. But that's part of how you're wired, right? It's that connectional human piece. And so this isn't saying, my gosh, describe the people. No, how exciting to look at folks and to think about their stories, who they are, why they're here, why are they gathered. Is this space make me uncomfortable? Or am I starting to feel more comfortable here? And if it is making me feel uncomfortable, why is that? Why is that? What do I think God is doing in the lives of the people that are here that they might not even know, that I surely don't know about? But what is it that God could be doing here? And what might God be up to in this space? So that's kind of the investing in presence. Just making yourself members of your guiding team, be present. And you know what I love about that? Somebody like me, it just takes all the accountability, responsibility, and work out of something, doesn't it? I just got to show up.
It's life-giving, Susan.
It's life-giving. I know. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to write a report or a verbatim up.
Susan, you're like me.
Yeah.
I was in seminary with an FBI agent who's Methodist, and she said, you walk in a room and it's like candy. And she said, I walk in a room and go, for all these people walking for me.
Exactly.
But I'm like,
yay! Yeah, there's just something about it. Yeah. It's like we had an interim pastor just left, and he said, he stood in front of, he'd just been there shortly, he stood in front of a group office, and he said, I have a confession to make. What is it? Yeah. I am an addict, a people addict. Isn't that great? He said, I am absolutely obsessed with people and their stories. And here's the interesting thing. I don't think that has anything to do with introvert and extrovert. Because some of the best listeners I know are which ones? Quiet people. They're the introverts. And they love being around people. They love hearing that story. Now, they need to be energized. They need to they're energized by being by themselves, but it doesn't mean that they're not people. We get confused about that, but it's how you're energized that defines introvert, extrovert. All right, and so as we move to the next piece, which is investing in relationship. And here's the thing that we were also talking about at break is even when those blocks failed that the kids are putting together, and even when the project doesn't work out exactly like you want, I'm going to tell you some of the best relationships that I have in life are people I have failed with. Say that again. Some of the closest relationships that I have in my life are people that we have failed together in trying something. Because you don't pull yourself up out of bootstraps and learn a lot about. So even though stepping out and experiment might not work exactly like, because we're subject to always thinking end result, right? Deliverable. The joy in the journey and the relationship built. And if we go back and look at this passage that we had this morning, what is it that allows people to step out together? What is it what's the foundation of any relationship out there? It's trust, right? Even our relationship with our Lord and Savior is trust. And so in this process, in this journey, getting to know each other, building relationship is the life-giving work. Here are some examples of some building or investing relationships together. This is an example of different ways, and this is on this might not be on the slide. Okay, this is on page 14 in your book. 13, I'm sorry, page 13.
It is on the slide behind you, Susan.
Okay. Think back though, where might be a relationship that you've built? One was shared this morning. Renee shared it. I just was in tears when you were sharing this. Where's a relationship that is being a little more vulnerable and we're growing together aside from already doing that action work together? Might it come with introducing this work to your congregation? Renee's story, I thought, was just beautiful, of introducing this work and then having someone that you never would have imagined be moved to tell his or her story. That's rich. I think that's rich. So some of the examples of relationships might be just in introducing this work, the listening, the sharing that you do, what keeps you spiritually alive, what has led to your spiritual growth. Someone you didn't know in your congregation until recently. I go to a pretty big church, and this has actually happened for me during COVID, during times that we weren't even worshiping together. Isn't that one of the beautiful things? Not through this work, but sometimes it happens through the sharing of our lives. This work is what prompts that. Someone that you might have come across while walking the neighborhood and taking pictures. Does anybody have a story to tell about that already? Relationship that you might have already built through the work that you started to do. You're observing the neighborhoods. Okay. As you move into your action planning step and you invest in those relationships, it might be someone that you bump into in those places. A leader in your neighborhood or town. I'm betting, Alice and I were talking already, I bet this is going to be a big one for y'all. Folks that you bring in that you know have some other input, some other vision that will join in you in this work that you're doing as you're listening to what God is doing. An actual physical neighbor. Y'all, I am a really good friend. I am not a good neighbor. Mm-hmm. I hate to admit that to y'all. I have a next door neighbor, lovely person. We've been there 17 years. I've had 2 conversations with her. I gotta do better at that. In my own neighborhood, y'all. A physical neighbor, a coworker, or someone you just happened to meet. I love the story that husband just told about over breakfast. You know, God's word over breakfast.
We've been trying this at the office. Robin and Presley and I have been trying some of the faithful innovation stuff at the Presbytery office. And you all know we're on Woodruff Road. And it's not really the neighborhood we live in, but it's the neighborhood we work in every day. And on both sides, one side is a 16,000 people, 6,000 member Catholic church.
6,000 families.
Preston has worked because she used to be the pastor of the church. Yep. And then on the other side is Eastminster Presbyterian, which right behind that, there's $400,000 minimum up to probably $800,000 homes jam-packed in on these little half-acre lots. A lot has changed in our working neighborhood in the last 5 to 6 years. And so what we've noticed, other than the turkeys keep showing up, is that people keep walking across our parking lot and people keep showing up in walking around between the neighborhood and the church with their dogs, throwing frisbees. And so we've kind of turned into this natural in-between space. So there's a lot of stories we could tell, things that I've tried, things that Robin's tried, connections that Presley's made for us because she worked there. But Robin particularly, someone you came across while walking the neighborhood, she decided to take a big giant dog dish and put some water in it because the dog walkers were like a dog park. That's my dream. That's what I want to do. But she's listening to the guy that worked in the neighborhood. And it's actually turned into a bird bath instead of the dog bowl. The birds spend more time in the water in the bowl. But Robin, if you see someone walking around the Presbytery office with a dog, Robin knows the name of the dog and she knows the names of the dog owners. She has come and she's learned, hasn't she? Mostly she'll tell us, but so she's learned the neighbors around us, which is a huge witness and testimony. And it's just paying attention to what's going on. And that's just one example. And that was such an easy thing. That wasn't a lot.
Most time it is easy, isn't it? I mean, it's just having eyes open to it. And Robin,
Well, I think we don't take time to do
right,
that.
that's
So,
right.
I mean, there's a lot that, Robin probably could be doing besides going out with your neighbors.
Right.
Because some sessions are not getting their minutes in on time, you know what I mean? I mean, there's a lot of things that go on that keep us, or whatever Robin else does,
But it was the intentionality of this way
Exactly.
of thinking that, of course, y'all know Robin, so that's probably no surprise. But yes, yes.
So that's it. Thanks, Debbie, for sharing that because I know between our phones and our to-do lists and all those things that say get there, do this, accomplish that. Nice to be able to just say part of this work is not work at all. Right? Part of this work is really not work at all. And it's okay. Let me say the slide. It's okay. Okay, let's look very quickly at the next slide. This is investing relationships. Some of these things, just by nature of who you are, the ministries that you have, these are the things that you've already done in your lives. So just some examples of things that you can continue to do to be invested in people's lives. I love knowing more about the dog, knowing about the child, going to a sporting event, inviting people over, those kind of things that come naturally in ministry to being intentional about that. All right, let's move on. And this is just giving you some examples. Again, these are tickles for you to begin thinking about what might make sense for your experiment. And the next slide is, these are some options. This one's beautiful. We actually did this at our church. I think Robert Bannon might have known about this, and I don't know. Have any of y'all ever done prayer ribbons? Did you do them, Whitney?
Not at this context, I know them before.
Yeah, and again, it's not real complicated, but it was powerful, and we kept them tied to a tree outside on our front lawn. And it was a great thing that people asked about. So a prayer experiment that a church had done. Love that picture, Kristen. Sitting on the front lawn, making yourself visible. Again, I think that one to me would be investing in presence and investing in relationship, right? There's a book called The Turquoise Table that I talked about this last time. I've got a friend, young couple in our neighborhood, put 2 picnic tables out in their front yard. We love it, just watching people gather. Hanging out in a new place, we talked about that a little bit. This new restaurant, I'm there. Listening to spiritual stories. Isn't that a beautiful thing when you can get to that point? What I have found too, and y'all know this, was it C.S. Lewis that said, "What, you two? I thought I was the only one." That's what builds friendship, community. So sometimes share a little bit of your own story, your own heart. It encourages people. Going to a kids event. And I'm telling you what, when you're a grandmother, especially when your grandchildren got live in town, ooh, I love this one. This will give me joy just to be there. All right. Eating with a neighbor. Borrowing a tool. Now, I found this one interesting, and this is in your book. You can read about it. Borrowing a tool. Wow, that's something to think about. Because what's that allowing somebody else to do? Trust, yes, I love that. Trust that they would lend it to you, but also maybe it's giving them an opportunity to serve you a little bit.
And I think it's hard in our current 21st century American mindset. So, I mean, I like to flip this one too, to also offer to lend a tool.
That's good.
To me, that's less risky than asking to borrow a tool. Plus, I know how my own spouse is about his tools and how, how people take care or don't take care. But I've said to him, what does it mean if you allow someone to borrow your tools? So I have to kind of flip that one.
That's a good one.
And for us, depending on what your hobbies are, your tool might not be a hammer. It might be a video camera. It might be a laptop. It might be an artist brush. Presley, you're about to say something. Yes.
And that's what we did. Didn't you always used to do that growing up? Your mom did that to borrow a show?
We don't do it very much anymore. Yeah.
I love this. If y'all see these plates, the giving plates, or where the whole idea is to take a baked good and you take it on the plate, and then they are to then pay it forward to somebody else. Which is a sweet thing. Okay, are there any? Pray at the laundromat. We talked about this in terms of probably want to get permission from the manager before you do it. But there's one down from my house. I think that's a beautiful idea. So let's look at real quickly. There's a list, and we're going to run through these real quick. As you plan your next step, they're on your the list that we went through. That is on page 15, 14. Okay, let's look at 14.
That's the list you just went through.
And that is, if you look at it, what they've identified there is they're breaking that down so you can see what were those 2 prongs I said, investing in
Relationship.
presence and relationship, right? And I was just thinking about that, and maybe I'm wrong stepping out because I didn't like this curriculum, but I think sometimes it's both. I think sometimes it's both, right? So think about those 2 ways as you gather together, these 2 approaches. Look at these are actual examples, the slides that Presley just told you, of real life examples of what other churches have tried. And you have a whole plethora of things, that other churches have tried or have thought about. But this is just really a tickle to get us back to that place of play, that place of imagining, that place of being creative, that place of thinking about what might be happening off our church property in our neighborhoods where God is working. So we're going to spend the next time together. 15 minutes, Preston, is that good? Okay, it's everybody. I think y'all are combining as a guiding team. We'll go back to the groups that we're in. And now's the time. Roll up sleeves. Roll up your sleeves. Some of you have already started those conversations. But you'll want to think about what it is, because we'll not meet again until October. So you'll have an opportunity that you can spend some time, have some meetings on page 7. No, we don't need to death. That's right. That's what we said. We don't need to death. You'll have some opportunities in life-giving to work together as friends. Here, I'll call it that. On slide 75, here, look, that we're going to talk about what is your design. Here's a key one, because y'all, what can make or break any experiment? Communication, right? Somebody else said. Yes, buy-in, communication. I love what Christy said. Y'all's group came up with, maybe it's inviting the person that's the most solid in your congregation that hates change. You know, that's a solid personality. I would not be that person. I would be expressive. But think about not only your experiment, but how are you gonna get the word out? How are you gonna invite others to be part of this work? And we'll rotate around and help you. Any questions before we get started?
Is this on page 15 what we're doing?
Yes. Yes.
I've got blank ones too that I'll come and share, so.
I think in a couple different contexts. And so one would be our guiding team. So that's your church experiment, but challenge yourself to do one personally. So you're doing a very personal, intimate experiment, and while you're also doing one with your team of 5 to 7 in your church. And so that gives you a couple of pH litmus test experiments going on at the same time. And remember, learning is not transactional, it's transformative. That's the key piece too. So if it feels like you're making a transactional experiment, you might want to back up and ask yourselves, how do I make this more of a transformational? You measure that a little differently. And you can raise your hand, ask us questions, we can come around, we can chat. I think this is, it's not easy. We try to overcomplicate it. So just let us know if we can help.
And remember that you have a coach, you know. So
How is everybody? Thumbs up? Right, so the closing question is the closing question that we have all been asking ourselves as we do this work together. That is the sailboat question that Hudson shared with us earlier. Where has the wind of the Spirit shown up for you today? Where have you seen and how have you seen God at work in our time today? I'm going to invite us just to go around one or two words or a sentence. In creative energy. Creative energy. Hearing what? What is God? Where is God? Where is God? Just hearing the mantra, where is God? Where is God? Thank you, because we were talking about that over here in one of these conversations. Just being reminded to ask the question, where is God? Listening. Thank you. Thank you.
I was going to say, speaking of listening also, but also just feeling the Spirit's presence in some of our sharing.
Mm-hmm. Feeling the Spirit's presence. Seemingly such a simple thing, yet so deep. Thank you.
Me too, feeling that he's guiding us in the right direction.
Guidance in the right direction.
Just keep being open-minded and be imaginative.
Having an open mind and being imaginative.
Shared encouragement as we're trying to connect. It's in, shared encouragement.
Shared encouragement. Thanks, Anthony. Hudson?
I mean, your comment about being a good neighbor had me thinking, this question, I just have to keep coming back to it in my own, even in my own neighborhood. What is God doing on my street? What is God doing in my neighborhood? This was a exciting but also convicting question, both of those things at the same time. So.
What is God doing in my neighborhood?
Susan?
I think what the word God put on my heart today was just permission. Permission to breathe, permission to just follow him and not have it figured out. I mean, I keep going back to the slide. It's okay. That's from
I'll go next since I'm kind of in the logical order here because you never want to be logical. I just came back from being on the West Coast and my body, my mind's still about 3 hours earlier than it is today. I wouldn't have given it. This is the hope that our church, our denomination, our little corner of South Carolina, all it made, the choice that we're making to be here. So hope is my word. Presley? I know she's
I think one of the things that really I'm gonna go away with is that reframing of the word failure. And then as long as you're learning something, it's not
reframing failure.
Mhm.
It's all about learning. Ooh, that's another mantra. So, thank you. Communication.
Well, yesterday I was in a really bad funk. And this morning I was about ready to blow this off. And
We're so glad you're here.
but I learned, I guess not learned, but I reinforced that although I'm somewhat a loner, I am a people person. And, you know, I got in the car with these three and I was quiet for a while and I started coming alive. And then as soon as I walked in the door here, it was like, all right, I can start thinking because I'm around people. So I learned I think better when I'm around people, even though I'm sort of a loner. So I think God was with everybody here today. You know, changed my day around, so I thank all of you.
Thank you for being so vulnerable to even tell us that story. And that is transformative learning. Y'all feel it? We're glad you're here too. Allison. Hopeful energy. Oh, thank you. I
She
can't,
learned she needs to bring a blanket.
I can't see you because we're long sleeves. Thank you. What you got for us over there?
I'm gonna say just focus, because I'm not focusing, I'm already at the end of the process. And I gotta focus on the beginning, you know, keep this simple and just listening and learning.
Susan said it earlier, somewhere in her, our portion of the training, is the weight comes off when you ask the God question, you know, it's God showing up. The other way we do it in our tradition is, in Christ I will, or in Christ we will. So with Christ at the center of the work, the heavy lifting is not on us. If it's to be, it's not up to me. If it's to be, it's up to us in Christ. I'm gonna invite someone to close us in prayer, and I'm going to invite us to consider not be someone that has MDIB. Anybody want to close?
Debbie, I don't have an MD. I will if you'd like me to. I got a DUMMY after my name.
What does that say?
Yeah, that's right. I just want to take this minute to thank the Presbytery, Presley and Debbie, and where our Presbytery is leading us and going. I too, you know, Jim, I had one of those weeks, you know, and I knew I wanted to be here like Debbie, but it was kind of like, and I think we just all leave knowing that it's nice to be filled up by the Spirit in each other, isn't it? Let's go to Him. Gracious God, Creator of everything we know, Creator of each of us, you instill in us a need to create, a need to innovate, and you've gifted us all in different ways to do that.
Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for the blessing of this work. It's not really work. Give us a light heart that is about you. That when we go forth every step in this journey, that we might be your light. We might touch those in the way that you would have us touch them. And that in that, our hearts can be forever changed. Let us go forth in this place in deep, deep gratitude that you have been here with us and that you will be with us as we go forward to do your work that you have called each of us to do for your glory. And it's in your Son's name we do.